This morning we are very pleased to have with us Zak Cochrane, who is a member of the Socialist Workers Party and a leading member of the Stand Up to Racism organisation, and he's going to be talking today about, after the referendum, why we oppose all immigration controls.
Thank you. I wanted to start, really, what better place to start than the EU referendum that took place just a week ago. I think you'll all agree that it was a carnival of reaction, to be honest, in the mainstream discussion. We had the ramping up of the most vile racism and xenophobia, most probably symbolised by the image I've put up there of Nigel Farage using refugees as a political football and suggesting that this had anything to do with the Britain's leaving the EU. Many people have compared it to 1930s Nazi propaganda. But what's fair to say, it wasn't just a Leave campaign, was it? Both sides of the debate, the official campaigns, the Leave and the Remain camps, were involved in ramping up racism against migrants and dragging the debate to the right. If you remember back to the very onset of the discussion, David Cameron's supposed renegotiations with the EU was all about, like the most important thing discussion in the EU was how long migrants should be denied benefits for. This obsessed the whole news media for the whole a very long time. And I raise this because the referendum was by no means the only election that we've seen where there's been a ramping up of racism. If we go back to the general election last May, UKIP receiving 4 million votes, the European election before that, UKIP winning a quarter of the votes, very much along the same lines of attempts to drive the issue of immigration to the fore, and the mainstream parties absolutely responding to that. So with this in mind, is it then a surprise to us that we hear all the time, don't we, people say, as almost a common sense, that we need tougher immigration controls in this country? Is it any surprise in that climate that has been fostered by politicians and the media? Something else that's happened around the EU referendum, since the EU referendum, I should say, is there's been a spike in racism. We can argue about the extent to that. We can argue that the media suddenly, newspapers like The Sun and the Daily Mail, that suddenly decided to cover racism. But I don't think we should deny that there's been a spike in racism, and it's not just been aimed at Eastern Europeans. We've seen halal butchers in Walsall, petrol bombed, black communities, Asian communities feeling vulnerable to the threat of racism. And I raise this because I think it makes a very prominent point, actually, and that is there's a contradiction, really. It contradicts the arguments that we often hear from the likes of David Cameron, that it's not racist to talk about immigration. Yet, since the referendum was dominated by immigration, suddenly racists feel emboldened to commit the kind of vile attacks like we've seen in Walsall. And in fact, we can say that people at the top of society are very well rehearsed in using immigration controls to stir up racism. Another image I've got for you, just there, is of Michael Howard. You'll remember this is the work of Linton Crosby, who just received a knighthood. It should have been a knighthood for racism, really, because for a long time he's put kind of posters like this, dog whistle politics of are you thinking what I'm thinking, or the very crude, crass racism of the likes of Nigel Farage. And this is something that is implicit, really, with immigration controls, is how they're used to encourage racism, because they're based on the idea that certain people do not belong here. There's certain people who shouldn't be here, and there's certain people that don't belong here. And usually, as you'll all know, this comes to mean Eastern Europeans, black people, Muslim people, and Asian people. Indeed, one of the few professions that you can actually legally racially profile is an immigration officer. They're allowed to look at someone who's perceived to not have the right to stay here and racially profile on that basis is at the very root of immigration controls. And we see, don't we, too often politicians, I go back to Nigel Farage, use immigration as a way to push the most crudest racism. If you go back to the European elections, the scaremongering around Romanians, the disgusting racism that Romanians were responsible for the most pickpocketing, that we should be worried about living next door to them. Even if I could take you to a more recent example, the Cologne attacks was used as a justification to not allow refugees into the country because they were supposedly a threat to women in Europe. And one of the most notorious examples of this that some of you will know or even remember is Enoch Powell's 1968 Rivers of Blood speech. Bear in mind that in the 1960s, Britain had slowed, the economy had slowed, and more people were leaving the country than were entering it. But it didn't stop the likes of Powell ramping up racism and encouraging even repatriations when his racist Rivers of Blood speech that argued for not only the deportation of people, but argued that there'd be race riots if this was not the case. But the idea that there are certain people that don't belong here is central to much also of the justifications we hear around Fortress Europe at the moment. Fortress Europe, the system of border controls that's used supposedly to protect Europe from an influx of migrants, is a notion that's built around the principle of excluding people from Africa, from the Middle East, and from Asia as well, who are deemed to be bogus or bogus asylum seekers, criminal or illegal. And in its most crudest form of discrimination, it's based on this racist myth that there's a common European identity, traditional European nationalisms that we've seen come to the fore again with the refugee crisis, the likes of this rhetoric of a clash of civilizations as a justification for Fortress Europe and a justification for countries riding roughshod over the Schengen Agreement and putting up the borders. We see, for example, the Hungarian PM, Viktor Orban, who defended shutting the borders to refugees on the grounds that refugees were a threat to Europe's Christian identity. This is what he said. If you're being overrun, you can't accept migrants. We must forget that those who are coming, must not forget that those who are coming in and have been brought up and under a different religion and represent a profoundly different culture. The majority are not Christian but Muslims. This is an important question because Europe and European culture has Christian roots. Or is it not already, and in itself alarming, that Europe's Christian culture is barely able to uphold Europe's own Christian values? He's not the only one. The next president of the EU, the Slovakian Prime Minister Robert Fico, echoed this sentiment, saying that Islam has no place in Slovakia. This is someone who's going to be the next president of the EU. And a feature, I think you'll agree with me, of the refugee crisis has been the far right being able to capitalise on some of this racist mainstream discussions about refugees. We've seen across Europe a complete polarisation in Germany, where we've seen, fantastically 1 million refugees in, the ordinary people responding fantastically by welcoming refugees. On the other hand, the whipping up of anti-refugee racism, the burning just in the last 5 months alone of 40 refugee centres in Germany. And more broadly, in France, Marine Le Pen receiving the highest ever vote in the last French regional elections. In Austria, we might have some Austrian comrades here, Austrian far-right fascist party coming within 1% of taking the presidency off the back of capitalising on the refugee crisis. So let's be absolutely clear that immigration controls allow those at the top of society to stir up racism and discriminate against those who are deemed not to belong here. But another reason we absolutely should oppose immigration controls is, concretely, they're responsible for a large number of deaths. I think the starkest example of this, I'll just get this picture up. I think I'll take it off. I don't know if it should sit through there, but I think it's one of the starkest examples of the brutality, really, of the border system. Aylan Kurdi, a 3-year-old toddler who last September absolutely shocked the world when he washed up on a beach in Turkey after trying to cross into Greece. And his story, if you've heard it, is absolutely tragic. His family fled from Kobani in the Syrian town of Kobani to Turkey to escape ISIS. They're a Kurdish family in Turkey, faced discrimination. They're not able to work there. They face violence and repression from the police. They had no option but to flee in a dinghy and risk their lives. And I think the image capsulises really so much the story of thousands like Ireland, and his brother and mother who also tragically drowned. It capitalises the thousands of people in the same position around the world who are fleeing war, persecution and dictatorships, and face the brutal borders. And the death was absolutely completely unjustifiable. If you think that Greece borders on to Turkey, up until a few years ago, you could cross technically very, very easy, but since being in the EU, millions and millions of pounds of euros have gone in through Frontex, the border agency, in making thousands of miles of concrete borders and barbed wire to force refugees onto onto taking a risk on the sea. We see this, don't we? The appalling, horrific scenes of hundreds drowning in the Aegean Sea this year alone. And since the EU-Turkey deal, that rightfully human rights organisations have absolutely come out and condemned the idea that you take people's right away from even claiming asylum and send them back to a place like Turkey is absolutely horrific. But since then, people are having to take the far more dangerous routes of the Mediterranean. It's now turned the Mediterranean into an effective graveyard of the EU. 8,000 refugees and migrants have drowned there in the last year. So we should be absolutely clear that the very nature of borders and the risks they make people to take, we should absolutely be opposed to that as well. And it's happening a lot closer to home. In Calais, more than 30 people have died since last June trying to reach Europe. These trying to reach the UK. These have been people forced to try and cross across the channel, being hit by trains, being hit by cars, being electrocuted and suffocated in the back of vans. For those who can't make it across, they have to remain in the jungle, horrific refugee camp of asbestos, of rat infestations now, of no stable food, in absolute cramped, disgusting conditions. This really is the story of Europe's borders that we should absolutely oppose. And, I mean, the reality of the border system, I think the sight of the likes of Ireland Kurdi drowned in is absolutely horrific, and it repulses people across Europe. The idea that after the last election, where UKIP get 4 million votes, 100,000 people are out on the streets in September saying refugees are welcome here. It shows you really just even in this country, the national repulsion at the border controls. But one thing we should say is that people absolutely do still accept the answer that some borders are necessary. We do hear this argument. People come up with arguments, for example, that if tens of thousands of people come here, where the hell would they all go? But when you actually start to begin to examine some of these assumptions, you see a lot of them aren't true, quite frankly. The idea that if there was no borders that Britain would be flooded by migrants, history proves this not to be the case, actually. The first peacetime immigration controls were not in medieval times, actually. They were in 1905. They were brought in on a wave of strikes happening at the town, being led often by migrant workers. But it was brought in for racist reasons of closing the door to Eastern European Jews escaping the Russian Empire. And what was very interesting about this time, of course, before then the entire population did not come to Britain. Just 2 years earlier, a Royal Commission report of 1903 found that Britain had a far smaller amount of migrants than other European countries. And even today, contrary to Nigel Farage's posters, the refugees and migrants in Calais represent about 1 to 2.5% of the over 1 million refugees in Europe. So it's not true that everyone's trying to come here. The other argument that Britain is full up and that there's no space for refugees and migrants is absolutely something we should challenge as well. I mean, the population density of Britain is 260 people per square kilometre, around the same as Vietnam. The Netherlands has a higher population per people of 400 per square kilometre. But this doesn't necessarily translate anyway, have any relationship to the standard of living. A country like Albania has half the population density of the UK, but the standard of living is generally much lower. And what we should also say is there's vast swathes of this country that lie completely uninhabited. Only 10% of British land is built upon. We've actually got twice as much space used for golf courses than is used for housing. Golf courses account for 2% of the total area of the UK, and if it was built, if you built on that with residential areas instead, you could provide houses for space for about 8 million homes. It shows you the absolute irrationality of this system. But let's be clear. A lot of people's experience, isn't it, is that it's very hard to find decent housing or accommodation. And politicians and the media are the first people who blame this on increased populations caused by migration, or claim that refugees and migrants are bumped to the top of the queue for housing. We hear this lie a lot as well. And it is a lie. I mean, less than 10% of general needs social housing as a foreign citizen living there. And most refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants are not allowed even onto council housing waiting lists. But the housing crisis is not being caused, we should be absolutely clear, by increased population. There's a lot of evidence that the housing shortage in the UK would continue even if there was zero net migration. The UK, for a number of decades, has experienced real house price growth, as you'll all know. This is something you'd need over 270,000 houses a year to be built to stabilise a house price to an income ratio that people could actually afford. And therefore, the UK housing shortage will continue to worsen, as I said, even if we had zero net migrations. And if you think about the hundreds of thousands of homes that are left empty, particularly by big landlords who have got no interest in providing homes for people but want to use the property to make a profit out of it. There's enough housing in this country, over nearly 700,000, that could house the homeless population of Britain 3 times over, and every refugee in Calais. Across Europe, there's 11 million empty homes that could house all of Europe's population, homeless population, and every refugee in Europe twice. It really shows you the irrationality of the system we live under. But the myths around housing shortages and lack of space are legitimised by immigration controls. They encourage a very dangerous idea, I'd argue, that workers should be competing with each other for the limited set of resources that there are. But the truth is, that there's no fixed number of jobs, there's no fixed number of housing or services to go around. If more people come here, we could easily expand the services to meet the needs of extra people under a system that would put working people and their needs before the needs of profit that we currently live under. We, the workers, create the wealth in this system, as our French comrade reminded us yesterday in the opening rally. And it's through our struggle that can put the wealth in the hands of ordinary people. But I want to talk just quickly about the function of border controls. We should be absolutely clear that as well as encouraging racism, regardless of the level of immigration, you'll hear the media and politicians whip up panic about immigration flows. The function of this primarily is about dividing workers from each other by pitting the supposed native workers against the migrant workers. Karl Marx discovered this over 100 years ago today. I apologise if some of you have heard the quote, but it's still so relevant today. When talking about the antagonism between the English and Irish workers, Karl Marx said, "Every industrial and commercial centre in England possesses a working class divided into 2 hostile camps. English proletarian and Irish proletarians. The ordinary English worker hates the Irish worker as a competitor who lowers his standard of life. In relation to the Irish worker, he feels himself a member of the ruling nation and so turns himself into a tool of the aristocrats and capitalists of his country against Ireland, thus strengthening their domination over himself. And it goes on to say this antagonism is artificially kept alive and intensified by the press, the pulpit, the comic papers. In short, by the means at the disposal of the ruling class. This antagonism is a secret of the impotence of the English working class, despite its organisation. So Marx was absolutely clear then, as we can be absolutely clear today, that immigration controls are about dividing people, that workers divided actually, people who scapegoat migrants actually are working against their own class interests and working in the interests of the people at the top of society. And we've seen too often this repeated. Gordon Brown, the last Labour Prime Minister, notoriously come up with the slogan, British jobs for British workers, that we hear so often, a term used by the far rights. And you know, the more workers are divided against each other, it absolutely plays into the hands of the bosses and gives them greater control over the workforce. The divided workforce is less able to fight back for jobs, for better pay and conditions. And also the system of immigration controls, of raids, of detention centres, of deportation hangs over migrant workers. It allows bosses, while they're in a precarious situation, to harm all workers, to try and push down wages of migrant workers. We should be absolutely clear. It's the bosses that do this through pushing competition between workers. And we also see, as I mentioned earlier, migration controls are used to shift the blame away from big businesses and governments and to migrants and refugees, to scapegoat them for the social problems caused by capitalism, like poverty, homelessness, low pay and poor services. And they're also a way of us turning our anger against them. I'd go back to a quote at the start of the refugee crisis from Philip Hammond, the Foreign Secretary, who whipped up racism towards the refugees by saying that marauding migrants are a threat to our living standards, which is absolutely laughable. If you think that a man from a government that has attacked our living standards from the last 5 years to tell us that we should fear refugees and migrants from across the world. Let's be absolutely clear that it's people like that are responsible for the poor conditions and overstretched services, not migrants and refugees. The second reason that capitalists benefit from immigration controls is it allows them to control the flow of labour as well. The capitalist system is international. Products are manufactured all over the world. And capitalists who own and control the international banks and multinational corporations need to rely on a global pool of labour to be available to them, to enable them to fill demand for labour. They want a mobile workforce. They want a pool of labour available at their beck and call. This is sometimes why we hear the hypocrisy of politicians and the media who whip up panic about immigration, at other times encourage it when it's good for business and they need more labour. So this was something with migrants from the former colonies, when they were needed in the boom years. Actually, it was a very different, a lot of propaganda welcoming people to the UK, as well as a load of racism that come after. But the nation state functions as a central mechanism to control the movement of people. It ensures that capitalism maintains control over labour, and rather than allowing people to travel at will. But we should be absolutely a part of rejecting the idea that our movement should be controlled. If you think about the trillions of pounds, the trillions of yens, of euros that can travel around the world at the touch of one button, yet the capitalists forced us in nation states to be controlled by their borders. It's a grotesque hypocrisy and really tells us about the kind of system that we live under. If capital can move at the touch of one button, if bosses can up and move resources, close factories, destroy lives and jobs, we should argue for a society where workers should have the right to move as well. The best vivid example of this was just a couple of weeks ago. I mean, many of you, I recognise, were on the convoy to Calais. 250 vehicles going over to Calais to show refugees in an area that's supposedly free movement of labour. The fact that we were stopped, this aid convoy, at the French border and banned from entering France on spurious accusations of terrorism, the idea that we were going to cause trouble when we were over there, the idea that an aid convoy of 250 vehicles could just be stopped there really shows you the level of hypocrisy and how the borders are used to police working class lives. And let's be absolutely clear, one of the reasons I think that aid convoy was stopped was because it was happening at a crucial time. The bosses, as I said before, rely on us divided and pitting us against each other. What we were trying to do was show an absolute act of solidarity with workers who need that solidarity, and the French government responded by trying to stop that act of solidarity. But what I wanted to say is it's absolutely crucial we continue to unite the struggles for refugees to wider struggles that we face here against racism and against austerity. Uniting our struggle with migrant workers when they fight back, with refugees fleeing war and persecution, actually make our side stronger, and we can turn our attention back where it should be, on the government. July 16th, I think, is a crucial date for everyone's diary. Stand Up to Racism have organised a demonstration alongside the People's Assembly against racism and against austerity, and calling for the Tories to go. It's exactly these kind of initiatives that pull together people, working class people, and redirect our anger where it should go on the same government who's attacked our pay and conditions for the last year, and whip up racism and war across the world. In terms of capitalism, the chaos it has caused for millions of people across the world. You see the wars, the idea that 96% of the refugees that have come to Europe are from Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. Three places of Western intervention shows you just what a barbaric system this is, and how people's lives are uprooted by capitalist powers in imperial conflicts. If you look at climate disasters, if you look at trade agreements that languish countries in debt as well, it shows you that this system is absolutely brutal and barbaric and cannot deliver for most people, and this is why they need borders. So when we're fighting borders, we're fighting for a better kind of society. We're fighting for a society without borders, and at the same time making a case for a society where there's enough resources to go around, where a society where resources are distributed by need, not on profit. This is the society we need to fight. So the anti-racist fight is absolutely crucial. The fight by using vehicles like Stand Up to Racism, we can garner support from a wider layer of people, which is absolutely crucial. But as socialists, we should argue within movements like Stand Up to Racism, not just that refugees should be welcome here, but we should have an end to borders, because they're about dividing us all. I'll stop there.
All right. I've got 4 points to make. My first point is issue of land and how it relates to working class. And I think most of the time when we talk about working class or middle class, we forget to talk about how land has played a significant role, particularly during the Enclosure Act. If you remember then, the so-called peasants were basically pushed away off their land and pushed into the city, who would then now become the factory workers. And in that regards, I want to make a statement that working class itself is an unintended consequence of capitalism. And I think that this is my second point now, that capitalism will not hesitate in an heartbeat to eradicate working class or middle class. And the point is, when you look at the advancements of technology, and technology is basically slowing down, kind of like eradicating workers. And if you then eradicate workers, then you eradicate incomes. When you eradicate incomes, then you cannot really consume on anything. And when you look at Fordism, the way it's that, Henry Ford, only find up a chance that $5 a day was paying his workers, were able to spend it on this product which he was actually producing, and that's how mass production and mass consumption happens. And so in a way, a migrant is not really like Zak said. It is the capitalist institution or the state basically use it as at one point in time when they needed it most, and that's one point. And the second point I want to make, if I can remember that. Okay. Some of you must be aware of my case. There's one type of immigration that we are not really talking about, which is the non-EU international student. And non-EU international students contribute about 40 billion to British economy every year. And this kind of people talks about prevent, but prevent actually start from the countries where the student comes from, where they have this thing called CAS system. That's a certificate admission something, I can't remember, basically barcoding non-EU international student. So in a way, effectively, the university has no choice to recruit students. Can you sum up, please? All right. Has no choice to recruit students, but by becoming a border guard themselves. So in a way, if the student if the Home Office says, oh, this person is not willing, cannot be a student anymore, the university can just turn around and say, you have to go. So the idea of education is a kind of autonomous society. It's not really working. So I just really want to call your attention to that as well.
Okay, thanks very much. You, and then
I have a question or issue that I want to address to Zak, but I want to preface it by saying that I totally agree with just about everything you said, that immigration controls are inherently racist, and that the refugee crisis is an obscene mark for the whole human race and should need to be addressed at all sorts of levels. But the question I'd like to raise, and perhaps it isn't an issue here, but it certainly is back in the States, and that is that allowing free immigration, particularly of Muslims, will allow terrorists to come in and bomb San Bernardino and actually they can't claim many things. Homegrown terrorists have done most of the damage, and that is the view, for instance, of the Republican candidate for president, who might well be elected, Donald Trump. He will ban immigration of Muslims until we, quote unquote, sort it out, who is a good Muslim and who is a bad potential terrorist. Now, I haven't heard much discussion. Maybe the way the border controls work, that's not an issue. It was, as Donald Trump points out, an issue in Paris. One or two of the terrorists had come in through the Middle East channels. So that's basically my question. But otherwise, I thank you for your talk, and I totally agree. Capital has free movement, so should people. Thank you.
Thank you. And then, comrade here.
Hi, I'm from Vienna, from Austria, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about the situation there, because I think, obviously, I guess a lot of you have followed the situation, and actually it came out today that we have to sort of do the election again because of irregularities. So Hofer has another chance of winning, and to be honest, the situation doesn't really look good, because the right wing and especially the FPÖ has used the situation with refugees to build their political movement. But I also want to talk about the other side that I think hasn't been that much in the media, and that was the huge solidarity movement in Austria. Because especially last summer, like thousands of people helped at the train stations in Vienna and across Austria. Hundreds of people immediately went down to the borders of the south to help people, to help refugees. And let's not forget that. And it ended up sort of in October with a demonstration of over 70,000 people on the streets and 150,000 celebrating at a concert. And I think we have to to focus on those people when it comes to our political activity, because it wasn't just the solidarity and the actual sort of help with refugees. What happened was sort of the movement of refugees on the one side of the border and the movement of the people in Austria in solidarity actually managed to break down the borders for a couple of days. Eventually, and the government lost completely control. I think we should focus on that situation because that's in the end where we wanna end up, sort of. And by now, I mean, the government has sort of regained control, tried to build up fences. But even in that situation, you know, local owners of vineyards there said, like, no, you can't build a fence in there. So they built up a fence, and then there was sort of no fence for 100 meters where people could just pass by. And it's also those little sort of moves of resistance that we have to focus on. And there are big challenges ahead of us. And I think meetings like this, the discussions that we have about immigration controls and so on, are important, because it's the arguments where we can win people to our side, to our perspective on society, and we have to make sure that Hofer and the Freedom Party are not the only ones that say something, but that we not just say something, but also show solidarity in practice, on the streets, and every day. Thank you.
And then you. Okay, thanks.
We talked a lot in the referendum campaign about Fortress Europe, but I think it's very important now, as anti-racists, we talk both and take seriously the rise in racist attacks, and it's very, very important we talk about Fortress Britain today. You see, we're almost unique in the argument that Zak is putting. The right wing, we know, use racist scapegoating all the time. But the reality is that almost every organisation on the left of British politics accepts some version of the argument for immigration controls. Even people as honourable as John MacDonald, in the last week of the referendum campaign, said we need to revisit the question of free movement. Len McCluskey, the leader of the biggest union, Unite, talks in similar terms. Almost always the argument is posed on the left as we have to impose immigration controls, otherwise there'll be a rise in racism. And that's why the argument Zak has put is so critical, because for us, we see immigration controls as a source of chauvinism, a source of division in the working class, and something that promotes racism. And it applies to the arguments over terrorism. You see, the reality is that the French attackers were almost exclusively born in France. They were French citizens. But pages after pages in the press were devoted to trying to prove they had some connection to Syrian refugees. Now, if we accept this argument, it promotes a climate of hostility to Muslims, to migrants, which actually feeds the terrorist groups that are trying to grow. Our argument is we have to undercut that racism and build unity inside the working class. And this is a critical reason why we oppose immigration controls. It's not simply a humanitarian argument, but we believe that the poison of racism both binds a section of the working class to the ruling class, and it divides our side, and it means we will lose every time. We don't allow the poison of racism to seep into our movement. Final point I want to make is this. Why do racist ideas and immigration controls have such resonance? Because they fit with people's lived experience, and people's lived experience is we do feel like we compete over jobs. We do feel that there aren't enough houses. We do feel that our public services are shoddy. Now, how do we respond to that? We have to take up the arguments from the 1930s, and particularly the experience in the East End of London. So you remember the East End of London in the 1930s now for the Battle of Cable Street, where the left came out and Jewish people came out to block the British Union of Fascists marching down Cable Street. It's a heroic battle and one that we should remember. But it wasn't just that. The left in the East End of London also went to working class communities and said, we will defend you from eviction from your home, we will defend your services, we will defend your jobs, and they built a movement of Jews and non-Jews against the racists and undercut racism. We need a hard fight over racism and a fight to defend working class interests. That's why the 16th of July is critical. It's a demonstration against racism and austerity. It's in the finest traditions of the left in Britain. Everyone has to go out and build it.
Thank you. You and then you.
Hi, I'm Janneke and I'm from Holland, so I feel responsible to say something about the EU-Turkey deal because it came into being under my government. The logic behind it, why it was so easy to put it in place, I think, is because the atmosphere in my country is very racist. We had Wilders saying that male refugees are coming over and they're all testosterone bombs and coming after our wives and our daughters, etc. So the Turkey deal was put in place because Holland was, until yesterday, the chair of the European Union, and our Prime Minister and Shadow Prime Minister, the Shadow Prime Minister being a Labour MP, and 10, 12 years ago I remember him campaigning for Greenpeace, and now he's doing EU-Turkey deal. So this is how far it came in our country. They put it in place because they knew they wouldn't have so much resistance. Now I want to make a point about Turkey, because the EU-Turkey deal says that we can send back Syrian refugees from Greece back to Turkey because Turkey is a safe place. Well, it's not. Erdogan is waging a war against the PKK. We've seen just a couple of days ago the attack on the airport, Atatürk Airport, maybe most important in this debate is that at the Syrian-Turkish border, people are being killed. 11 people last week, 60 people over this whole year. So if Donald Tusk is saying we shouldn't criticize Turkey, well, yes, we should. The last point I want to make about the resistance in Holland is invisible indeed. Like the Austrian comrade said. But the thing is that behind the scenes, actually in Holland, there are more people willing to be a volunteer to help refugees than we have refugees itself in Holland. So, but this is a nice thing to mention, but it's all part of the humanitarian kind of aid, and it's not very political. So one of the things that we have to raise as political activists in Holland, I was just at this in the other meeting about tax, Panama Papers and tax havens and so. Holland is a tax haven. So the slogan we should raise in Holland is refugees are welcome, tax avoiders are not.
Thank you. Okay. After this comrade, it will be you.
Hello, my name is Jabir Muhammad Abdullah. I am from Sudan.
Could you talk into the microphone, please, comrade?
I'm from Sudan, and also my English is little, but I want to try.
Zach, could you move the...
I want to try to speak, to explain more. I want to speak from my heart. I want to say about my town, Barnsley. When I come to Barnsley, I find many refugees and asylum seekers in difficult situation because we are rejected from Home Office. So I gathered all these refugees and asylum seekers in one place and give him the hope and ask him what the problem. He said we have rejected from Home Office, refused 3 years, 2 years. It is too difficult for him. I told him, don't worry. Okay. Because I'm afraid. Okay. I told him, don't afraid. I gathered my friend, all my friend. I gathered him in one place. And I told him, don't afraid. Everything is coming. I give him hope. I told him, the tiger, you be strong like a tiger. And the eagle loves the life of space. And the tiger was still strong. So be strong like the tiger. And we be like the eagle loves the life of space. This is the hope I give my friend. I'm not an important man like Barack Obama or David Cameron. I'm a man who loves his friend. He give him the hope. This is what happened in Barnsley. My friend, I changed the life of my friend. I want to say, I am like you. I have a family in my country. I have a car, I have business, I have everything. But now I lost everything. But I win my life. I win my life and the love of British people. I have more British people in Barnsley love me. This is the life. Difficult for me, for my friend, refugees and asylum seeker. I never forget my friend when he died in the sea when he crossed the border from Libya to Italy. And the last sign for my friend, he didn't make like this. What does it mean when you make like this? This means it's finished. But my friend, when he started, he make like this. What does it mean? This means continue on. Continue on, Jabir. This is message. My friend, he wants to send message to you. This means continue on, Jabir. Continue on and say to English people, the people from Africa didn't come to take your money. The people from Africa didn't come to take your house. The people from Africa, they need protection. The people from Africa, they live with dignity or die in the sea. The people from Africa, they live with dignity or die in the sea. I'm sorry, thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade. And you next. Sorry, Comrade, can you hang on 1 second, please? This Comrade's speaking. Sure, I'll write you down. Thanks.
Okay, tricky to follow that, but I want to come at this from a slightly different angle and say that when I left university in 1976 in London, I quickly found a hard-to-let council flat, and I had a job as a park keeper while I worked out what on earth I was going to do with my life. And with 2 days low pay, I paid a month's rent. And I think it's important to say this not just to make the young people weep, but to point out that today you would need 32 days of low pay to pay a month's rent. And this has transformed Britain. And there are within Britain, shelter, food and warmth are not options of lifestyle options. They are the precondition for avoiding death. And there are tens of millions of people in Britain for whom shelter, food and warmth are at least precarious or unavailable. And so it's no wonder that there are millions of people throughout Britain who have given an audience to these terrible ideas coming from Farage and others. So how do we break those ideas? I've been going along to the Momentum group. I'm a member of the SWP, but I've been going to the Momentum group and I've been made very welcome. And I went to the last one where they had a discussion on alternative economics, and interesting. And at the end of it, I said, we don't really need alternative economics necessarily. We need alternative priorities as an urgent prerequisite. And I suggested, what about if we called on Corbyn through the organisation to make an immediate proclamation to say, on day one of a Labour government, I will identify 10,000 late career building workers to work with 100,000 unemployed 18-year-old young men and women to build 3 million council houses in the course of the first, year of my government. If he were to say that, I think we could completely transform the situation, double the size of this mass movement that we saw building last summer, and wipe away the audience that Farage has found for these backward racist ideas. That's the sort of audacity we need, a transformation on the scale of 1945.
Thank you, Ken. And then after Ken, the woman comrade who was here just now, you're next. Okay.
I think I entirely agree with what Joseph was saying before about how important it is for revolutionaries to say we're against all immigration controls. But it can get a bit depressing when you find that the common sense of, as people have said, not just the right wing of the Labour or the Tories, but almost everyone, is that immigration controls are necessary. And I think that you can sometimes get to the situation of thinking, well, that means we're just isolated and we can't do anything. And I think this actually shows something about the contradictions that come into people's heads in capitalism, shows that why this isn't a reason for simple despair. Because while people accept the ideas about the kinds of divisions that capitalist society puts into us, and you think, in my workplace we fought for this, we have to think about isolated groups of people, and therefore we think about Britain as an isolated group which has one cake and if the workers are to get so much of the cake, that means we can't let other people come in who'll take some of our cake. You start accepting all these arguments. At the same time, these people have experiences which go completely against that. And as many people have said in this discussion, so many people have said they want to help refugees. And I think that the experience through the last year of people saying again and again, after they saw things like Aylan Kurdi, saying we've got to do something, we've got to let them in, and that efforts that the government went to say, no, you've misunderstood this situation, we don't want to let them in, we need to stop them coming in. But to me, the fact that the government has to go to such levels to do that, to try and get people to turn on refugees, shows the potential for us of cutting through the common sense that says we've got to isolate ourselves from other people and actually having people uniting together. That's why with what we've been doing with Stand Up to Racism has been so important, because it has again and again been bringing people together. The whole thing about the convoy to Calais, the money that we raised and took was important, but in a way the most important thing was getting against the idea that people should be divided. So really I just want to reiterate the point that says why the demonstration is on the 16th is so important, because it's not a case that we should all despair and think that, as a lot of people are saying after the referendum, racism has taken over, there's nothing you can do. There is a battle on, it's a battle to fight, and it's a battle we can win.
Okay, thank you. Comrade, you, and then you, and then you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Fatimata Sharif. I'm a resident of UK. I've been here almost 11 years, but I can't say everything. I just want to say, do anybody like the war to hear? Do anybody would like to hear the war no to your right? Would anybody would like to hear the war no to your right? For example, like EU, I regret that they refused the EU to be part of UK, because I got family and friends that always travel to Holland, Belgium, to see my family, and sometimes they come. But also, again, I think the EU is not doing well to help the migrant to join with their family. For example, I'm almost becoming a victim of the Mediterranean Sea, my son, because we refused for them to give them visa. Almost 3 months I've not heard from my son. So in that case, I'm really, very frustrated and depressed that the EU and the working class are not doing enough to help with the migrant. My country went to war 15 years. These are the reasons why some are came in this country to rescue us, to save us. But then, at the same time, we're being refused for our family to join us because of some financial crisis. And you know that job market is really tight in this country, so I'm going through this threat. I alone don't want to help. So that's my problem. I think the EU is not doing very well to help the migrant, to help individuals who really go in struggle by themselves with us now. They won't know it hurt everyone. I'm really regret that they refuse for them to join the EU, the UK, but it's really painful when they say right no to you for your own right. That's my message.
Thank you very much, Mike.
Comrades, you may recall an infamous speech that Nigel Farage made in 2014, just ahead of the European Union elections, which really catapulted UKIP to the centre of British politics. It was a speech in which he talked about a train journey out of Charing Cross, where he said he travelled for mile after mile after mile, station after station after station, and didn't hear the English language being spoken. It was a lie. It was a lie in the same way that that poster that Zak put up at the beginning of this meeting was an absolute lie. I can tell you actually about a journey I made where I did used to hear languages from all over the world being spoken. It was the 10-minute journey I used to make every day to Stratford underground station, and the reason I could hear all those languages was because of the thousands of workers from all over the world who were flocking onto the Olympic site to build those stadia. And you know, you think about it, every train journey journey early in the morning, every bus journey where you see workers from all over the world going to work in the NHS, to clean the offices and so on. That's the reality of the world we live in. Workers creating all of the wealth that the bosses profit from, and that's the fundamental reason why we say we're opposed to all immigration controls, because workers create all of that wealth. They are entitled to travel wherever they want to across the globe to reclaim their share of that wealth. Zak mentioned Gordon Brown and his British Jobs for British Workers speech. Gordon Brown was the Chancellor who deliberately encouraged immigration from Eastern Europe. Why? Because he knew that he needed workers from all over the world to come and rebuild UK PLC. So workers were welcome then. Hypocritically, they became unwelcome when it didn't suit him politically. The sheer hypocrisy of the bosses, the politicians, and the ruling class knows no bound. Even after and it's little wonder that workers can accept some of those ideas when they are relentlessly pushed by the press and the politicians. Even after the referendum, the Daily Express headline was what? Thousands of migrants flocking to come to Britain before the European Union, before we leave the European Union. Still at it afterwards. We have to say, of course workers can accept those ideas, but it is not inevitable. There is, as Ken and Joseph and others have said, a battle for ideas. And in that battle, we have to argue against the racist ideas, but offer real concrete solutions. And that's precisely why a struggle and a demonstration against austerity and racism is so important. Building the picket lines in support of the teachers, which means, the teachers' picket lines, NHS picket lines, having workers from all over the world who work in those institutions on the picket lines and struggling together is so fantastically important. Concretely, fighting austerity and racism.
Thank you. Please, followed by the comrade in the red T-shirt.
Hi, I'm from Lewisham Momentum, just to start it off. But I'd like to maybe remember Jo Cox. I believe that her death was due to the ramping up of racism that you mentioned earlier this morning. And we seem to have forgotten her. Everything's moved so quickly. She was murdered, assassinated, doing her job as a representative of the people because she treated her constituents fairly. She was murdered, assassinated by a white racist man. And I thought at the time, and I looked at how the press handled that. They called it a killing. It wasn't a killing. It was murder. It was an assassination. And then because she was killed by a white racist man, everybody forgot about it. If she'd been killed by someone of another colour or religion, then it would have been on the front page over and over again. So she died as a result of this referendum and the nasty racist behaviour of the right. And I feel that we should remember her, remember this assassination in our country because of this awful racism.
Thank you. Comrade here, followed by comrade at the back.
Yeah, well, I wanted to say two quick things, really. The first about the role of the Labour right in this disgusting referendum campaign that's just happened, but then also about border controls more generally, because I think Zak was completely right to start with that UKIP poster, which reflected Nazi propaganda and all of that, which exemplifies in many ways the disgusting depths to which this racist campaign sunk. But to a certain extent, we can expect expect that sort of racism from the likes of David Cameron, from the likes of Nigel Farage, from the likes of Theresa May. These are politicians that have built their careers on attacking multiculturalism, on attacking Muslims, and on attacking migrants. But the day before Jo Cox's murder, what did we see on the television? Gordon Brown on the news saying, the problem isn't European migrants coming here, it's Albanians. Look at these people trying to cross the channel in dinghies and so on. The illegals, they're the real problem. And I think we have to remember as well that Gordon Brown has form on this issue. He was part of the government that in 1998, against the background of the intervention in Kosovo, whipped up a scare against asylum seekers, bogus asylum seekers, so-called, that were escaping that situation. And also look at the posture of these people when the Leave campaign was talking about the danger of Turkey joining the European Union and of Turkish migrants coming to this country. Instead of standing up to that racism, instead of saying that migrants are welcome here, instead of saying that there is no problem with Turkish people coming to this country, they said, no, don't worry about it, Turkey will never be allowed to join the European Union, and all of this sort of stuff. And that perfectly dovetails with dog whistle Islamophobia, I think, which says on the one hand that, it's fine for European migrants to come here and all of that sort of stuff, but if it's a majority Muslim population like Turkey or Albania, then somehow that's some sort of problem. I just want to finish up by saying that, of course, we have to take on the arguments about resources. It is a complete nonsense to talk about resources, a scarcity of resources, in a situation in which there are 600,000 empty homes in England alone. But we also have to turn the logic of migration pushing down wages on its head, I think. And we have to say that it's not migration that pushes down wages, but it's actually border controls. If you produce a situation where a section of the population doesn't have the same rights to benefits, to council housing, and the same rights as other workers, then you will demoralise that section of workers. You will make them less likely to face up to the bosses. You will make them less likely to join unions, and you'll make them less likely to fight back against the system. And therefore, getting rid of border controls is part of building the fight against the bosses.
Right, Wayman is going to be the last speaker, so thank you all for your contributions, and yeah.
I want to thank Zak for his speech, and I was just on the radio now discussing the question of refugees, and they were discussing two things. They were discussing the Somme, and they were discussing refugees. That's their internationalism, actually. The only time they wanted to discuss international people travelling was war, when people killed each other, and then that was the only time they wanted to discuss the multiple questions of how to support the refugees. The second thing is, when they came up with the question of resources, suddenly they said there was a question of resources for people in this country, but that wasn't the case. When Brexit happened, they came up with £250 billion overnight. They didn't say there was any question of resources. Not a question of resources, it's a question about which class is divided. And the question of internationalism absolutely matters over refugees and how we treat people, because the real question is, how do you win the argument both now, and how do you connect that with the future? Last year, we saw the Glasgow girls come here and speak about how you can build solidarity with those people threatened with deportation, and how there's a sense in this country about why people want to support people, and why there's nothing inevitable about them being able to do it. I tell you, when we did M19, when we did the last demonstration that took place, the reason why that happened was because it mattered that socialists were at the heart of trying to build resistance. It matters building the type of politics that says that we want to have a world in which it doesn't matter where people are from, in terms of internationalism, that's the heart of how you build the resistance. On the 16th of July, in terms of breaking the question of the racist spike, it matters how we link those two, austerity and fighting racism, together. There's nothing inevitable about the far right or about racists being able to dominate. In most people's minds, the question of looking towards the enemy, the people that run our society, is fixed there, and we've got a chance of being able to win it. And I think every time you've looked at those questions, I think socialists have been at the heart of it, with the heart of M19, with the heart of the question of austerity. And part of that means, I think the bigger the socialist movement, the bigger the left, the bigger the Socialist Workers Party, the less the question of compromising, partly working with people from the Labour Party, working with people from Momentum, but we have to fight for also a better society, because part of the crisis that's taking place now is that there's going to be 32 more million refugees coming. The crisis is not going to break, and the truth of it is there isn't a solution for it in the way that they've posed it in the present situation, and therefore we have to look for the bigger ideas about how you change society in totality. We have to fight against it now, but we also have to have a process about how we fight to change our world totally, and I'll stop there.
I just want to start really where Wayman left off, actually, with the point that more people will come under this system, this despicable system. It is, as Rosa Luxemburg once said, socialism or barbarism. While we live in this system of climate disasters, of constant wars, of the restriction of resources for working people, people have no choice but to flee. And this is why I think the point the Austrian comrade made is absolutely crucial. The refugees welcome movement across Europe will play an absolutely crucial role, because one thing we've seen is an absolute polarisation across Europe between left and right, particularly around the question of refugees. Those that want to welcome the refugees and those that want to use it to capitalise and whip up racism. So it's absolutely crucial, and it is something, and this is something Stand Up to Racism has tried to do. We can harness actually a support for refugees and pull that into a wider anti-racist politics to build an anti-racist movement that can push back the racist offensive that is too often used to justify austerity and wars. And this is why what Joseph said is absolutely crucial. We don't just fight for no borders or against racism for a moral issue. It's absolutely about unity if we're going to win, because when we're weakened and divided, actually that's how the bosses are able to win. And this is why it's so self-defeating when we hear John McDonnell and Len McCluskey, who we absolutely work with fraternally, but concede arguments around immigration. I think it's absolutely fantastic when I've seen Jeremy Corbyn make speeches actually refusing to be drawn in to the conceding ground on immigration. But let's be frank, he's quite isolated on that position in his party. If we can, and one thing Paul Foot used to say, actually, Labour win elections when workers are confident. So this is why it's absolutely crucial to unite people and to link up the struggle against racism and turn that back against the struggle against austerity. That's why July 16th becomes absolutely crucial. The idea that 17 million people reject the views of the CBI, of David Cameron, of practically every mainstream party. I don't think this is 17 million racists. I think absolutely clearly these are people who are sick of their lives being torn apart by a conservative government and a EU they can see as responsible for that. So what we need to do is to use July 16. We need to use Stand Up to Racism to push back the racist offensive, to unite workers, to continue to fight in solidarity for refugees. And actually, when we're confident, the ideas of border controls, the ideas of austerity, we start to see the irrationality of it, and we can start to build the kind of society where we don't see those things. Thank you.